Settle in, close your eyes, and prepare to drift through the greatest mystery in the One Piece world. Tonight, we explore not just a gap in history, but an act of erasure so complete that even speaking of it is forbidden. 100 years removed from time. A century that officially does not exist. But erasure is never perfect. Silence is never absolute. Even when history is deliberately destroyed, voices survive. Fragments persist. Truth finds ways to endure. Tonight, we explore the Void Century through those who dared to seek it, those who died protecting it, and those who live carrying its burden. The scholars who decoded it, the child who survived its revelation, the scientist who proved it, the revolutionary who fights because of it. These are the voices that survived the silence. Let us begin. There is a hole in history. Not a gap that formed naturally through the decay of records or the passage of time. Not an absence created by chance or neglect, but a deliberate void. 100 years carefully cut out of the world's memory. Removed so thoroughly that most people do not even know to ask what happened during those years. Do not even realize that their understanding of history has a century-sized hole in it. This is the Void Century, and its very existence raises a question more important than any answer. Why would anyone erase 100 years of history? 900 years ago, the world entered this century. A period that, if we are to believe the few fragments that survived, was marked by conflict on a scale never seen before or since. A war that consumed the entire world. A struggle that reshaped geography itself. A conflict so significant that its outcome determined what kind of world would exist for the next 800 years and counting. This was not a regional war. Not a dispute between neighboring kingdoms. This was global, total, a fight over the fundamental question of how humanity would organize itself. And when it ended, when one side achieved victory over the other, the victors made a choice. They chose to erase the entire century from history. Think about what that requires. You cannot simply destroy all records and declare that 100 years never happened. People remember. They pass down stories. They teach their children what their parents taught them. To truly erase a century, you must do more than burn books. You must eliminate everyone who remembers. Everyone who witnessed. Everyone who might tell the story to someone else. This is genocide on a temporal scale. This is the systematic destruction not just of people but of memory itself. And the fact that the Void Century exists, that there is indeed a 100-year gap in the world's historical record, tells us that this genocide was carried out, successfully, completely, almost, because erasure is never perfect. No matter how thorough the victors were, no matter how many people they killed or how many records they destroyed, fragments survived. Hints, clues, questions that people asked and answers that some people found. And over the 800 years since the Void Century ended, since the erasure was completed, some people have dedicated their lives to recovering what was lost, to piecing together the fragments, to understanding what happened during those 100 years that was so dangerous, so threatening to the current world order that it had to be completely removed from collective memory. The world government forbids research into the Void Century. This is not a casual prohibition. This is a capital crime, punishable not just by the death of the researcher, but by the death of everyone associated with them. Their families, their colleagues, their entire island if necessary. This extreme response tells us something crucial. The Void Century is not just inconvenient history that the world government would prefer people not know about. It is existentially threatening. The truth of what happened during those 100 years, if widely known, would undermine the world government's legitimacy, would make people question whether the current world order deserves to exist, would provide an alternative vision of how society could be organized. The Void Century is forbidden not because it is ancient history, but because it is dangerously relevant. From 900 years ago to 800 years ago, records vanished. Not through natural decay, but through deliberate destruction. Libraries were burned. Scholars were killed. Entire civilizations that possessed knowledge of the Void Century were eliminated. And in place of the truth, a narrative was constructed. A story about how the world government came to be. About how 20 kingdoms united to protect the world. About how the current system, with its celestial dragons and empty throne and marines, represents the natural and inevitable order of things. This narrative is taught to children, is accepted as historical fact, is so thoroughly integrated into how people understand their world that questioning it seems absurd. The erasure worked. For 800 years, it has worked. But now, in the present day of One Piece, the erasure is failing. People are asking questions. Scholars are finding answers. The fragments that survived are being assembled into something coherent, something complete, something that threatens to reveal not just what happened during the Void Century, but why it was erased in the first place. The silence that has lasted for 800 years is beginning to break. The voices that were supposed to be eliminated forever are beginning to speak. And when they speak, when the truth of the Void Century finally becomes known, the world will understand that the hole in history was never empty. It was filled with a truth so dangerous that the most powerful organization in the world spent 800 years trying to ensure no one would ever discover it. This silence was enforced to bury the legacy of a powerful civilization. A civilization that has come to be known, in the few fragments that mention it, as the Great Kingdom. We do not know its true name. That name was one of the first things erased. But we know it existed. We know it was powerful. We know it represented something that the 20 kingdoms who would form the world government found intolerable. And we know that the entire Void Century, the entire 100 years of erasure, was necessary to ensure that what the Great Kingdom represented would be forgotten. That no one would remember there had ever been an alternative to the world government's rule. That the current world order would seem inevitable rather than contingent. That victory would seem like destiny rather than just the outcome of war. The Void Century is not empty. It never was. It is filled with the ghosts of a civilization that almost won. Filled with the memory of a different world that almost came into being. Filled with the truth that the world government cannot allow to be spoken. And now, after 800 years of successful suppression, that truth is beginning to emerge. The century removed from time is being returned to history. The voices that were silenced are finding ways to speak. And the world is finally ready to listen. To understand the Void Century, we must first understand what existed before the erasure. What kind of world gave rise to a conflict so significant that its victors felt compelled to eliminate all memory of it? The fragments we have, the clues that survived, point to something remarkable. Something that challenges everything we think we know about how societies must organize themselves. The Great Kingdom was not just powerful. It was different. Fundamentally, ideologically, structurally different from the kingdoms that opposed it. And this difference is what made it dangerous. The Great Kingdom flourished as something the world had never seen before. A civilization built not on hierarchy but on equality. not on the worship of divine rulers, but on the idea that no one deserves worship simply because of who they are. This was revolutionary, dangerous, unacceptable to the neighboring powers who ruled through divine right, who maintained their positions by convincing their populations that kings were chosen by gods, that some people were born to rule and others were born to serve. The Great Kingdom rejected this entirely, said that all people are equal, that leadership should be earned rather than inherited, that worship is slavery by another name and should be abolished. But the Great Kingdom was not just about political ideology. It was about how people lived, about what they valued, about the kind of society they wanted to create. And what they wanted, what they built, was a joy-centered utopia. This term might sound abstract, but it has concrete meaning. The Great Kingdom valued laughter, valued freedom, valued the ability of people to pursue happiness without systems forcing them into predetermined roles. This was not chaos. This was not anarchy. This was a highly advanced civilization that had solved the practical problems of governance and resource distribution in ways that allowed people to focus on living well rather than merely surviving. The technology of the Great Kingdom surpassed even the modern world. This is not speculation. This is confirmed by the fragments that remain, by devices that still function after 900 years, by engineering feats that contemporary science cannot replicate, by energy systems that modern researchers barely understand. The Great Kingdom possessed knowledge that has been lost, had achieved a level of technological sophistication that the current world, despite 800 years of progress since the Void Century, still has not recovered. This tells us something important. The Void Century was not a dark age. It was not a primitive time before Enlightenment. It was, in many ways, more advanced than the present. And the war that ended it represented not progress but regression. Not evolution but destruction of something better. What did this society look like in practice? How did people live in the Great Kingdom? We can only speculate from fragments, but certain patterns emerge. The Great Kingdom valued shared prosperity. Resources were distributed in ways that ensured everyone had enough. This was not forced equality, not communist redistribution, but a system where accumulation of wealth by some did not require the immiseration of others, where technology and organization made abundance possible for all rather than just for elites. This is what made the Great Kingdom's ideology so threatening. It proved that hierarchy was not necessary, that divine rulers were not inevitable, that another way was possible. The Great Kingdom rejected the idea of celestial worship. This is crucial. The kingdoms that opposed it, the 20 kingdoms that would eventually form the world government, ruled through the claim that their kings were appointed by gods, were themselves semi-divine, were deserving of worship and absolute obedience because of their celestial status. This was the foundation of their power, the justification for their authority. And the Great Kingdom said no, said that kings are just humans, that worship is inappropriate, that authority should be questioned rather than blindly obeyed, that gods, if they exist, do not care about human political hierarchies and certainly do not endorse any particular royal family. This ideological stance was not just theoretical. It had practical consequences. If people in neighboring kingdoms heard about the Great Kingdom's ideas, if they learned that societies could function without divine rulers, they might start questioning their own rulers, might start wondering why they should obey kings who claim godhood, might start imagining alternatives to their current systems. This is what made the Great Kingdom dangerous. Not its military power, though it had that. Not its technology, though it had that too. But its ideas. Its demonstration that another way was possible. Its existence as proof that the divine right of kings was fiction. That hierarchical societies were choices rather than inevitabilities. That people could organize themselves differently if they chose to. This ideology stood in direct opposition to neighboring powers. The 20 kingdoms that would unite against the Great Kingdom ruled through divine right. Through the claim that they were chosen by gods to govern. Through systems where questioning authority was heresy and imagining alternatives was treason. The Great Kingdom's very existence undermined these claims. Made them seem arbitrary. Made people wonder whether the suffering they endured under divine rulers was necessary or just convenient for those rulers. This could not be tolerated, could not be allowed to continue. The Great Kingdom had to be destroyed, not just defeated militarily but erased completely. So thoroughly that no one would even remember that an alternative had ever existed. The world before the fall was a world of possibility. A world where humanity had achieved something remarkable. Had created a civilization that valued joy and freedom and equality. Had developed technology that made abundance possible. Had organized itself in ways that allowed people to flourish rather than merely survive. This was not perfect. No society is perfect. But it was better. Better than what came before. Better than what would come after. Better than the world the victors of the Void Century War would create in its place. And that is why it had to be forgotten. Why the Void Century had to be erased. Because remembering the Great Kingdom would mean understanding what was lost. What was destroyed. What could have been but wasn't because the forces of hierarchy and divine rule won the war and remade the world according to their vision. The world before the fall was a better world. And the world government has spent 800 years ensuring no one remembers that. Wars are usually fought over resources, territory, access to trade routes or valuable goods. But the War of the Void Century was different. It was fought over ideas. Over how the world should be organized. Over whether divine rulers were legitimate or whether all people deserved equality. This makes it more dangerous than any conventional war. Because when you fight over resources, victory means taking what you wanted. But when you fight over ideas, victory requires eliminating the opposing idea completely, ensuring it cannot spread, cannot inspire resistance, cannot survive to challenge you again. This is what the 20 kingdoms understood. This is why they united. 20 kingdoms formed a secret pact. This was not a public alliance, not an open declaration of shared interests. This was conspiratorial, hidden, developed in back rooms and sealed with oaths that bound rulers to each other in ways their populations never knew about. Why the secrecy? Because openly uniting against the Great Kingdom would require explaining what they were uniting against. Would require acknowledging that the Great Kingdom existed and represented something different. Would risk their own populations hearing about the Great Kingdom's ideas and finding them appealing. So the alliance formed in secret? 20 kingdoms coordinating without their people knowing. Planning a war without public discussion. Preparing to destroy something they could not allow anyone to examine too closely. What did these 20 kingdoms demand? They demanded worship as gods. This was not metaphorical, not symbolic. They literally required their populations to treat them as divine beings, to bow without question, to offer prayers and sacrifices, to accept that the ruler's will was law because the rulers were chosen by celestial forces beyond human understanding. This system worked as long as no one questioned it, as long as populations accepted the claim of divine right. But the Great Kingdom questioned it, rejected it entirely, said that no human deserves worship, that kings are just people who happen to be born to the right parents. That authority requires justification beyond divine ancestry. When the Great Kingdom refused these demands, when it refused to acknowledge the 20 kingdoms' rulers as gods, when it continued teaching that all people are equal regardless of birth, war became inevitable. Because the 20 kingdoms could not allow this challenge to stand, could not permit an alternative ideology to exist where their populations might hear about it, could not risk their own people learning that societies could function without divine rulers. The Great Kingdom had to be destroyed, not just defeated, not just subjugated, but eliminated so completely that its ideas would die with it. This was the goal from the beginning. Total erasure, absolute victory. The creation of a world where no alternative to divine rule could even be imagined. This conflict marked the true beginning of the Void Century. Not when the first battle was fought, not when armies first clashed, but when the 20 kingdoms made the decision that the Great Kingdom's ideas were intolerable, that they could not coexist with a civilization that rejected divine rule, that the war would not end with negotiation or compromise, but only with one ideology's complete elimination. This decision transformed what might have been a conventional war into something else, into a crusade, into an existential struggle where defeat meant not just losing territory, but losing the right to exist at all. And the Great Kingdom understood this. Understood that the 20 kingdoms were not seeking conquest in any normal sense, were not trying to expand their territories or increase their wealth, were trying to eliminate an idea, to destroy proof that divine rule was not necessary, to ensure that no alternative to their system could survive. The Great Kingdom could have surrendered, could have accepted subjugation. But subjugation would require abandoning their principles, would require accepting divine rulers, would require teaching their children that hierarchy was natural and equality was impossible. This was unacceptable. So they fought, not because they wanted war, but because the alternative was the extinction of everything they believed. The ideological war began not with armies, but with a choice. A choice by the 20 kingdoms that certain ideas could not be tolerated. That the Great Kingdom's vision of equality and freedom was so dangerous that it had to be destroyed regardless of cost. And a choice by the Great Kingdom that some principles are worth dying for. That living as slaves under divine rulers would be worse than fighting and losing. That even if they could not win, even if defeat was inevitable, the fight itself mattered. The ideas mattered. The demonstration that resistance was possible mattered. Because ideas do not die easily. Because even if the Great Kingdom fell, even if its civilization was destroyed, the ideas might survive, might spread, might inspire future generations to question divine rule and imagine alternatives. This is what made the Void Century War different from any other. It was not about who would control which territories. It was about which idea would shape the future. Would the world be organized according to the principle of divine hierarchy, where some people rule and others serve based on birth? Or would it be organized according to the principle of equality, where all people have worth regardless of who their parents were? The 20 kingdoms won this war, established their vision as the foundation of the world for the next 800 years. But winning the war did not settle the question, did not prove their vision was right. It only proved they were stronger. And strength, as the great kingdom understood, is not the same as truth. The ideological war began 800 years ago, but it never truly ended. It just went silent for a while, waiting for voices to emerge that would speak the forbidden ideas again, waiting for the void century to be remembered, waiting for the war to resume. But the ideological war could not be fought with ideas alone. At some point, philosophy gives way to force. Principles require protection. And the great kingdom, facing an alliance of 20 kingdoms determined to destroy it, needed power. Not just military strength in the conventional sense. Not just armies and fleets. But something more fundamental. Something that could protect their civilization against overwhelming numbers. Something that could ensure their ideas survived even if their people did not. They created 3 forces. 3 powers that would come to be known as the ancient weapons. Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus. We have explored these weapons before. Have examined what they can do. The massive destructive force of Pluton. The command over sea kings that Poseidon provides. The sky-based power of Uranus. But understanding the weapons requires understanding their purpose. Why they were created. What they were meant to accomplish. And the fragments we have about the Void Century suggest something important. The ancient weapons were not originally tools of conquest. They were not built to dominate or terrorize. They were engineered as tools of balance and protection, as ways to ensure that the great kingdom's civilization could not be overwhelmed through sheer numbers. Pluton was capable of erasing islands. This is what made it terrifying. This is why it was called a weapon. But erasure is just one application of massive force. The same power that can destroy islands can also reshape landscapes. Can break through mountains to create passes. Can level terrain for construction. Can remove obstacles that prevent development. Pluton, in the hands of the great kingdom, was likely a tool for shaping the world. For creating the infrastructure that their advanced civilization required. For clearing land and creating channels and building on a scale that conventional technology could not achieve. The weaponization came later, when the 20 kingdoms attacked, when peaceful purposes had to be abandoned in favor of survival. Poseidon commanded the Sea Kings, these massive ancient creatures that inhabit the calm belts and deep oceans. Beings of enormous power that can destroy fleets or move islands. In the hands of someone with hostile intent, Poseidon would be a terrifying weapon. But the Sea Kings are not mindless monsters. They are intelligent. They have their own culture and prophecies. They serve Poseidon not through coercion, but through some kind of understanding or agreement. This suggests that Poseidon's purpose was not conquest but cooperation. Working with the Sea Kings to manage ocean ecosystems. To protect shipping routes. To ensure that the seas remained navigable and productive, to maintain balance between human civilization and the marine world. The weaponization came when this balance was threatened. When the 20 Kingdoms invasion required using the Sea Kings not for cooperation, but for defense. And Uranus controlled the sky. The details remain mysterious, but the implication is clear. Power over weather, over climate, over the atmospheric conditions that determine whether crops grow or fail, whether regions prosper or suffer. In a civilization as advanced as the Great Kingdom, Uranus would be essential for maintaining stability, for ensuring that droughts could be prevented, that storms could be redirected, that the climate could be managed to support the population. This is not domination of nature. This is working with natural systems on a massive scale. using technology to create conditions where life can flourish. The weaponization came when survival required it, when the invasion had to be repelled using every tool available. These were not born as tools of conquest but of balance and protection. This is crucial to understanding the Void Century. The Great Kingdom did not build weapons to expand its territory or dominate neighbors. It built systems to protect what it had already achieved, to maintain the civilization it had created, to ensure that the ideas it represented could continue existing. The weapons became weapons only when the 20 kingdoms forced them to become weapons. When peaceful coexistence was made impossible. When the choice became fight or die. And the Great Kingdom chose to fight. Chose to use its tools of balance as tools of war. Chose to weaponize what had been created for peaceful purposes because peace was no longer possible. This reframing changes how we understand the Void Century War. It was not two aggressive powers fighting for dominance. It was one power trying to preserve its way of life against 20 powers trying to destroy it. It was defense mistaken for aggression because the defensive tools were so powerful. It was the Great Kingdom using every resource available to protect what mattered to it. Using Pluton not to conquer islands but to repel invasions. Using Poseidon not to dominate the seas but to prevent fleets from reaching its shores. Using Uranus not to control the world but to defend the sky above its territory. These weapons, terrible as they were responses to existential threat. Were attempts to ensure survival in a war where surrender meant extinction. They failed. The Great Kingdom fell anyway. But understanding why the weapons existed, why they were created, helps us understand what was lost. Not a warmongering empire, but a civilization trying to protect something worth protecting. Trying to defend ideas worth dying for. Trying to ensure that balance and protection would survive, even if the people who created them did not. At the heart of the resistance stood a figure whose name has echoed through 800 years of suppression. Joy Boy. We have explored him before. Have examined his role in the Void Century. His connection to the Nika fruit. His promises to Fishman Island. But understanding Joy Boy requires placing him in context. Understanding who he was fighting for and what he was fighting against. Joy Boy was not just a warrior. Not just a leader. He was the living embodiment of what the Great Kingdom represented. Freedom. Joy. The refusal to bow to divine rulers. He was their symbol. Their champion. Their hope made flesh. Joy Boy awakened the Nika fruit. This mythical Zoan that embodies the sun god. The god of liberation. The deity who, according to ancient legends, freed slaves and brought laughter to the oppressed. This was not random. Not chance. Joy Boy's power aligned perfectly with what he was fighting for. With what the Great Kingdom stood for. Liberation from divine rule. Freedom from oppression. Joy as a fundamental human right rather than a privilege granted by gods. When Joy Boy transformed, when the drums of liberation sounded, it was not just a display of power. It was a statement. A declaration that freedom cannot be suppressed. That joy cannot be eliminated. That liberation is possible even against overwhelming force. The Nika fruit stretched reality itself, made the impossible possible, turned serious combat into something playful, something that defied the logic that the 20 kingdoms relied on. They fought with conventional power, with armies and hierarchies and strict organization. Joy Boy fought with chaos, with creativity, with the kind of freedom that cannot be predicted or controlled. This was disorienting to his enemies, frustrating. They could not understand someone who treated warfare like a game, who laughed while fighting, who seemed to find joy even in the midst of desperate struggle. But this was the point. Joy Boy's power was not just physical. It was philosophical. It demonstrated that the Great Kingdom's principles worked even in war. That freedom was not weakness. That joy was not naivety. That liberation was powerful enough to challenge divine rule. His drums echoed across battlefields as symbols of freedom. This image is important. Drums are rhythm. Our heartbeat are the sound of life persisting. When the drums of liberation sounded, everyone who heard them understood something fundamental. That freedom was still fighting. That the Great Kingdom still stood. That liberation remained possible, even when defeat seemed inevitable. The drums were not just Joy Boy's power. They were the Great Kingdom's anthem. The sound that said we are still here. We still resist. We still believe that another world is possible. And as long as the drums sounded, as long as Joy Boy fought, that belief remained alive. Joy Boy commanded Zunisha, the massive elephant that has wandered the seas for over 1,000 years. This alliance tells us something about Joy Boy's nature. Zunisha is not a mindless beast, is an ancient being with intelligence and memory. And Zunisha chose to follow Joy Boy, chose to fight for what the Great Kingdom represented. This was not slavery, not domination, but partnership. Zunisha and Joy Boy shared a purpose, shared a vision of what the world should be. And when Joy Boy gave commands, Zunisha followed them not out of coercion, but out of shared belief. This is how the Great Kingdom operated. Not through force, but through alliance. Not through domination, but through convincing others that their vision was worth fighting for. Joy Boy promised Fishman Island a future above the sea. This promise reveals what kind of leader he was, what kind of vision he held. Fishman Island exists 10,000 meters below the surface, separated from the sun, isolated from the surface world. And Joy Boy promised to change this, to raise the island, to bring fishmen and merfolk into the light, to integrate them fully into the world rather than leaving them segregated in the depths. This was not conquest, not expansion, but inclusion. The belief that all peoples deserve to live freely, to share in the world's abundance, to exist in the sun rather than in darkness. Joy Boy's promise to Fishman Island was a promise about what kind of world the Great Kingdom wanted to create. A world without separation, without hierarchy, without some peoples relegated to darkness while others enjoy the light. And Joy Boy entrusted Noah to Poseidon, this massive ship that sits in Fishman Island, waiting for 800 years, waiting to fulfill the purpose it was built for. Noah is large enough to carry an entire population, large enough to move everyone from Fishman Island during the process of raising it, large enough to protect them while the world itself was being reshaped. Joy Boy did not build Noah as a weapon. He built it as an ark, as salvation, as the tool that would make his promise to Fishman Island possible. And he entrusted it to Poseidon, to the mermaid princess who could command sea kings, who could pull the massive ship, who could guide it safely through whatever transformation was necessary. This is who Joy Boy was. Not a conqueror, but a liberator. Not a destroyer, but a builder. Not a warrior seeking glory, but a leader trying to create a world worth living in. Joy Boy stood at the heart of the resistance, was its symbol and its champion, was the proof that the Great Kingdom's principles could survive even war, even the most desperate struggle. He fought not because he loved fighting, but because fighting was necessary. Because the alternative was submission, was accepting divine rule, was abandoning everything the Great Kingdom stood for. And Joy Boy could not do that, could not bow, could not accept that the world had to be organized according to hierarchy and worship. So he fought. With the power of NECA, with Zunisha beside him, with promises made and Noah built, he fought for liberation, for freedom, for joy, for the right of all people to live without gods ruling over them. He fought and he lost, because the 20 kingdoms were too strong, because Uranus was captured, because even the greatest liberation cannot overcome overwhelming force. But his loss did not end what he represented. His defeat did not eliminate the ideas he fought for, because Joy Boy understood something crucial. That ideas survive beyond individuals. That liberation persists beyond liberators. That even if he fell, even if the Great Kingdom was destroyed, the principles would remain, waiting, dormant, ready to be awakened when someone else heard the drums, when someone else smiled in the face of divine rule, when someone else carried the will forward. Joy Boy lost the battle, but the war for liberation continued, silent for 800 years, but never truly ended, waiting for the drums to sound again. As the war escalated, as both sides committed their full strength, as desperation replaced strategy, the ancient weapons were unleashed together. This had never been meant to happen. The weapons were designed to work in coordination, yes, but for peaceful purposes. For shaping the world in beneficial ways. Not for war, not for destruction. But war does not care about intentions. War transforms everything it touches. And when Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus were all activated at once, not for balance but for combat, the consequences were catastrophic. The world itself was reshaped, permanently, irreversibly. The geography we know today, with its scattered islands and strange seas, was created not through natural processes but through war. Pluton bombarded coalition capitals. This was not random destruction. This was targeted. The Great Kingdom did not want to kill civilians, did not want to destroy everything. But the 20 kingdoms had united their forces, had established command centers, had created infrastructure to support their invasion. And these targets had to be eliminated. Pluton, with its massive destructive force, could accomplish this, could target the coalition's leadership, could destroy their ability to coordinate, could force them to scatter and regroup. But every shot from Pluton released enormous energy. Every island destroyed sent shock waves through the surrounding sea. Every bombardment contributed to destabilizing the world's geography. And as the war continued, as more and more shots were fired, the accumulated damage became impossible to ignore. Poseidon drowned invading fleets. The Sea Kings, commanded by the Mermaid Princess, rose from the depths, destroyed ships, pulled sailors into the ocean, created whirlpools and tsunamis that scattered the coalition's naval forces. This was effective defense. The Great Kingdom was likely a maritime civilization, island-based or coastal, and the 20 kingdoms had to cross water to reach it. Poseidon made those crossings impossible, made the seas themselves hostile territory. But the Sea King's power, unleashed on such a massive scale, had consequences. Ocean currents were disrupted. Natural patterns that had existed for millennia were broken. Water flowed in new directions, settled in new places, rose higher as the fighting continued. The seas themselves were being reshaped, not deliberately, not as part of any plan, but as the inevitable consequence of using power on this scale. Uranus countered from the sky. The details of how Uranus operated during the war remain mysterious, but the effects were clear. Weather became weaponized. Storms were directed at enemy positions. Lightning struck with impossible accuracy. Rain fell in torrents where the coalition gathered, and droughts afflicted their supply lines. Uranus gave the great kingdom control of the sky, made approaching from above impossible, made aerial assault futile. But manipulating weather on this scale had consequences. Natural patterns were broken. Atmospheric conditions that had been stable were destabilized. Climate itself became erratic. And as the war continued, as Uranus was used more and more desperately, these disruptions accumulated. Combined with the damage from Pluton and Poseidon, created cascading effects that neither side had anticipated or prepared for. The result was catastrophe. Not just military catastrophe, not just the destruction of armies and fleets, but environmental catastrophe, geographic catastrophe, the reshaping of the world itself in ways that could not be undone. Over 90% of land submerged. This is not an exaggeration. This is what the fragments suggest happened. That the world before the Void Century was mostly land with some seas, and the world after was mostly sea with scattered islands. The continents that had existed were broken apart, flooded, reduced to the islands we know today. This was not intentional. Neither side wanted this, but it was the inevitable consequence of using the ancient weapons in war, of treating tools designed for balance as tools for destruction. Sea levels rose unnaturally. Vegapunk would later confirm this, would prove that the current sea levels are not natural, are not the result of normal geological processes, are the consequence of what happened during the Void Century. The oceans rose dramatically, quickly, covering land that had been inhabited for thousands of years, drowning civilizations that had nothing to do with the war, forcing mass migrations as people fled rising waters, creating the geography we see today where most of humanity lives on scattered islands separated by vast stretches of ocean. This geography serves the world government's control, makes unity difficult, makes coordinated resistance nearly impossible. But it was not created deliberately. It was the accidental consequence of war, the unintended reshaping of the world through the use of powers too great to control. Continents shattered into islands. The great land masses that had existed were broken, fractured by the force of Pluton's bombardments, separated by seas that Poseidon's power had raised, made into the scattered archipelagos we know today. This fragmentation did more than just change the map. It changed how human civilization could function. It made large-scale political unity nearly impossible, made trade difficult, made communication between regions slow and unreliable. It created a world where most people never traveled far from their birthplace, never met people from other islands, never learned that alternatives to their own society might exist. This fragmentation, accidental as it was, served the world government's purposes perfectly, made their control easier, made resistance harder to organize, made the world exactly as they needed it to be. And the red line was formed, this massive wall of rock that circles the entire world, dividing it into halves, creating an impassable barrier that forces all travel into specific routes that the world government can control. The Red Line's formation during the Void Century War is one of the greatest mysteries. How was it created? What force could raise a continent-spanning wall of rock? Was it Pluton's bombardments piling rubble along specific lines? Was it Uranus's atmospheric powers somehow lifting and the Red Line was formed? This massive wall of rock that circles the entire world, dividing it into halves, creating an impassable barrier that forces all travel into specific routes that the world government can control. The Red Line's formation during the Void Century War is one of the greatest mysteries. How was it created? What force could raise a continent-spanning wall of rock? Was it Pluton's bombardments piling rubble along specific lines? Was it Uranus's atmospheric powers somehow lifting the Earth? Was it a defensive measure by the Great Kingdom that went wrong? Or was it the 20 kingdoms deliberately reshaping geography to create strategic advantage? We do not know. But we know the Red Line exists, stands as the world's most prominent geographic feature, and serves the world government's purposes so perfectly that its formation, whether accidental or deliberate, helped ensure their victory would last 800 years. The world as we know it was born in disaster. Created through the uncontrolled use of powers meant for creation turned to destruction. Shaped by weapons designed for balance being used for war. The scattered islands, the vast oceans, the strange currents and climate patterns, the Red Line dividing everything. None of this was natural. All of it was created during the Void Century, during the war between the Great Kingdom and the 20 Kingdoms, during the desperate final battles where both sides used everything they had without fully understanding the consequences. The world was reshaped. And in that reshaping, the conditions were created that would allow the world government to rule for 8 centuries. The fragmentation that made unity impossible. The barriers that made travel difficult. The geography that served control rather than freedom. The world born from disaster became a world designed for oppression. Not deliberately, but effectively. The Void Century created the physical conditions for the world government's dominance. And for 800 years, those conditions have persisted. Unchanging. Permanent. The legacy of war written into geography itself. Waiting for someone to reshape it again. Waiting for the ancient weapons to be used not for war, but for what they were originally intended. For balance. For restoration, for healing the world that disaster created. But the Great Kingdom did not just lose to superior force. They lost to betrayal, to the capture of their own weapons, to seeing the tools they had created for protection turned against them. Mid-war, when the conflict had already devastated the world, when both sides were exhausted and desperate, the coalition achieved something that changed everything. They seized Uranus. How this happened remains unclear. Was it infiltration? Sabotage? Did someone inside the Great Kingdom betray them? Did the coalition develop a counterweapon that allowed them to capture Uranus? The details are lost to history, but the result is clear. The Great Kingdom lost control of one of the ancient weapons. And with Uranus in coalition hands, the balance shifted. Irreversibly. Think about what this meant. Uranus controlled the sky. Controlled weather and atmospheric conditions. With Uranus, the coalition could attack from above without fear of counterattack. Could direct storms at the Great Kingdom's positions. Could use lightning and wind as weapons. Could make the sky itself hostile. The Great Kingdom still had Pluton and Poseidon. Still had formidable power. But fighting a war when your enemy controls the sky is nearly impossible. You cannot hide, cannot maneuver without being seen, cannot protect your population from attacks that come from above. The capture of Uranus did not immediately end the war, but it made the Great Kingdom's defeat inevitable. Just a matter of time. Pluton was sealed in Wano. This was deliberate. Not by the coalition, but by the Great Kingdom itself. Seeing that defeat was coming, understanding that Pluton could not be allowed to fall into coalition hands, someone made the decision to hide it, to seal it beneath Wano, to ensure that even if the Great Kingdom fell, even if its people were scattered and its civilization destroyed, Pluton would remain inaccessible, would wait for someone in the future who might need it, who might use it for its true purpose rather than for conquest. This was not just strategic thinking. This was hope. The belief that the war might be lost, but the principles worth fighting for would survive. That someday, someone would need Pluton not as a weapon, but as a tool for reshaping the world, for undoing what the Void Century War had created. Poseidon's bloodline was targeted. The coalition understood that Poseidon was not a weapon that could be captured like Uranus. Poseidon was a person, a mermaid princess born once every few centuries with the power to command sea kings. You cannot capture this power. You can only eliminate its wielders. And the coalition tried. Systematically, brutally. They hunted the mermaid princesses, killed them when they could be found, tried to end the bloodline that produced Poseidon. They failed. The bloodline survived, went into hiding, continued producing mermaid princesses who carried the power even if they never fully awakened it. But the attempt reveals how desperate the coalition was, how completely they wanted to eliminate every tool the Great Kingdom had used, how thoroughly they understood that leaving any ancient weapon accessible meant leaving the possibility of future resistance. Joy Boy failed to fulfill his promise. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Great Kingdom's defeat. Joy Boy had promised to raise Fishman Island, to integrate the Fishmen and Merfolk into the surface world, to create a unified world without separation between peoples. He had Noah built for this purpose, had made arrangements with Poseidon, had prepared everything necessary. But defeat came before the promise could be fulfilled. The war ended. The Great Kingdom fell. And Joy Boy, however powerful, however determined, could not complete what he had started. He left an apology, carved it into a poneglyph, told the mermaid princess he was sorry, told her that someone in the future would complete what he could not. This was not just an apology for a broken promise. This was a message, a declaration that even in defeat, even in death, the work would continue, that the promise would be fulfilled eventually, that what the Great Kingdom represented would survive. The Great Kingdom fell. Its cities were destroyed. Its people were scattered. Its civilization was ended. After years of war, after reshaping the world through the use of ancient weapons, after fighting with everything they had, they lost. Not because their principles were wrong, not because their vision of equality and freedom was flawed, but because the coalition was larger, had more resources, eventually captured one of the weapons, outlasted the Great Kingdom's ability to resist. War is not about right and wrong. It is about who can sustain violence longer. And the coalition, 20 kingdoms united, could sustain violence longer than the Great Kingdom, however advanced, however ideologically superior. The fall was not just military defeat. It was the end of an alternative vision for how the world could be organized. The elimination of proof that divine rule was unnecessary. The destruction of a civilization that had achieved something better. Survivors scattered across the world. Not everyone died. Not everyone was killed in the final battles or the purges that followed. Some escaped. Some went into hiding. Some integrated into populations controlled by the coalition and concealed their origins. These survivors carried memories, carried stories, carried fragments of the Great Kingdom's knowledge and values. They became the seeds from which resistance would eventually grow. The bearers of these, the families who remembered that once, long ago, a different world had existed. These survivors were hunted, were persecuted, were killed whenever discovered. But some persisted. Some survived long enough to have children, to pass down stories, to ensure that even in defeat, even in erasure, some memory of the Great Kingdom survived. This was not much. Not enough to preserve the civilization. Not enough to prevent the erasure. But enough to create doubt. Enough to make some people wonder whether the world government's version of history was complete. Enough to plant questions that would grow into larger questions. Enough to ensure that 800 years later, when conditions were right, the truth might be recovered. The Great Kingdom fell. But it did not disappear entirely. It waited, in fragments, in survivors, in memories passed down through generations who might not even understand what they remembered, in poneglyphs that could not be destroyed, in promises unfulfilled but not forgotten, in the will that refused to die even when its civilization did. The Great Kingdom fell, but what it represented survived, hidden, waiting, ready to be discovered by those brave enough to seek it. Before annihilation, before the final defeat, before the Great Kingdom was completely destroyed, someone made a decision that would echo through 800 years. A decision that would ensure the truth could never be fully erased. Joy Boy commanded the Kazuki clan to act, to preserve the truth in a way that could not be destroyed, to create a record that would survive no matter what the coalition did to suppress it. This was not just practical thinking. This was faith in the future. The belief that even if the present was lost, the future might be different. Might be ready for the truth, might use that truth to create something better. The Kazuki clan were master stonemasons. Their craft, passed down through generations, had reached levels of sophistication that seem almost magical. They could carve stone in ways that made it indestructible. Not just difficult to break, not just resistant to weathering, but truly indestructible. These stones could not be destroyed by any known means. Not by fire, not by force, not by time. They would last forever. And this is what made them perfect for preserving the truth. Because the coalition could burn books, could kill scholars, could erase every physical record of the Void Century. But they could not destroy the poneglyphs, could only scatter them, hide them, try to ensure no one could read them. But the stones themselves would persist, would wait, would preserve the truth until someone capable of reading them appeared. They carved the truth into indestructible stone. Not just any truth, the complete truth. Everything that happened during the Void Century. The existence of the Great Kingdom. Its values and achievements. The war with the 20 kingdoms. The reasons for the conflict. The use of the ancient weapons. The reshaping of the world. Joy Boy's promises. The defeat and the scattering. All of it, carved into multiple stones. Each stone containing part of the complete story. together forming a record that, if all stones were found and read, would reveal everything the world government wanted hidden. This was not just history. This was evidence. Proof that the world government's narrative was false. That their rule was not inevitable. That alternatives had existed and might exist again. The poneglyphs were born. Massive cubes of stone. Indestructible. Unalterable. Carrying messages in an ancient language that most people could not read. This language barrier was intentional. Not to keep the truth hidden, but to protect it. If the poneglyphs were easily readable, the world government would guard them constantly, would station armies around them, would make accessing them impossible. But by requiring specialized knowledge to read, the poneglyphs could be scattered, could sit in plain sight, could be encountered by people who had no idea what they said. And only someone truly committed, someone who had learned the ancient language, someone willing to risk their life to understand, only they would be able to decode the messages. This was a filter, a way of ensuring the truth reached only those who deserved it, who had proven themselves through dedication and courage. Scattered across the seas, they preserved a history the victors could never erase. This scattering was strategic. Poneglyphs were placed in different locations, different islands, different regions, some in plain sight, some hidden, some protected by kingdoms that might not even understand what they protected. This distribution ensured that destroying them all would be impossible. The world government would have to find every single poneglyph, would have to search the entire world, would have to eliminate every location where truth might be carved. And they could not do this without revealing what they were doing, without making people wonder why certain stones were so important. The scattering was defensive, a way of using geographic distribution as protection. The world was huge. Poneglyphs were scattered across it, and finding them all would require resources and attention that even the world government did not possess. But the poneglyphs were not just scattered randomly. They were organized, designed to form a puzzle. Some poneglyphs were historical, containing information about the Void Century itself. Others were instructional, explaining where to find more information or what to do with certain knowledge. 4 were road poneglyphs, red stones that, when their information was combined, pointed to Laugh Tale, the final island, the place where the complete truth waited. This organization meant that understanding the Void Century required effort, required traveling, required finding multiple poneglyphs scattered across the world, required piecing together fragments into a coherent whole. You could not just read one stone and know everything. You had to commit, had to make finding the truth your life's work, had to prove yourself worthy through the journey itself. And at the center of it all, at the end of the journey, on Laugh Tale, waited the Rio Poneglyph, the culmination of everything. The stone that compiled all the scattered information into a single, complete narrative. The full truth of the Void Century. Everything the world government had tried to erase. Everything Joy Boy and the Great Kingdom had fought for. Everything that had been lost, but was now preserved. The Rio Poneglyph was not just information. It was vindication. Proof that the Great Kingdom had existed. That their vision was real. That the war had been fought over principles that mattered. That the world could have been different. That alternatives to world government rule were possible. This was what waited on Laugh Tale. Not treasure in the conventional sense, but something more valuable. Truth. Complete. Undeniable. Preserved in stone that could not be destroyed. The Poneglyphs were Joy Boy's final act, his ultimate achievement. More important than any battle he won. More significant than his power or his promises or his military leadership. Because the Poneglyphs ensured that even in total defeat, even with his civilization destroyed and his people scattered, the truth would survive. Would wait patiently for 800 years. Would resist every attempt to suppress it. Would eventually be found by someone brave enough to seek it and capable enough to understand it. Joy Boy knew he would lose the war, knew the great kingdom would fall. But he also knew that defeat did not have to be permanent. That the truth, if preserved, could inspire future generations, could provide them with knowledge that would allow them to succeed where his generation failed. The Poneglyphs were hope, carved into stone, scattered across the world, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for the silence to break, waiting for voices to emerge that would speak what had been forbidden for so long. The stones could not be silenced, and therefore, the truth could not be silenced. It only waited. Patient as stone, eternal as the ideas it preserved, ready to be heard when the world was finally ready to listen. Victorious, having defeated the great kingdom, having scattered its survivors, having reshaped the world through war, the 20 kingdoms faced a choice. What to do with victory? They could have simply returned to their own territories, could have divided the great kingdom's lands among themselves, could have celebrated their triumph and resumed their previous existence as independent kingdoms. But they understood something crucial, that victory over the great kingdom was not permanent unless they ensured it remained permanent. That the ideas the great kingdom represented could resurface unless they controlled the narrative. That military victory alone was not enough. They needed ideological victory. They needed to create a world where alternatives to their rule could not even be imagined. And so they did something unprecedented. They founded the world government. This was not just a political alliance, not a confederation of independent kingdoms coordinating for mutual benefit. This was the creation of a new form of power, a central authority that would rule not one kingdom but the entire world. The 20 kings did not return to their kingdoms. They moved to Merigeois, established a new capital at the center of the world, positioned themselves literally above everyone else. They became something new, something beyond kings. They became celestial dragons, gods who ruled all of humanity. This transformation was deliberate, was necessary for their purposes, because ruling as kings meant being bound by the normal rules of kingship, meant being comparable to other kings, meant accepting that political systems could change. But ruling as gods meant being beyond comparison, beyond challenge, beyond change. Gods do not need to justify their rule. Gods simply are, and everyone else simply obeys. History was rewritten. This was as important as the military victory. Perhaps more important, the world government did not just defeat the great kingdom. They erased it from history, made it as if the great kingdom had never existed, removed every reference to it from records, killed everyone who remembered it, created a new historical narrative where the world government had always been the natural and inevitable rulers of the world, where the 20 kingdoms had united not to destroy a rival, but to protect the world from some undefined threat, where the void century was necessary erasure to protect people from dangerous knowledge. History is power. Whoever controls the past controls the present. And the world government, understanding this, took control of the past, rewrote it entirely, made their version the only version, made questioning that version a crime. The Void Century was outlawed, not just hidden, not just suppressed, made illegal to research, made forbidden to discuss, made punishable by death to seek information about. This extreme response reveals how threatened the world government felt, how fragile they understood their position to be despite their military victory. If the truth about the Void Century were widely known, if people understood that the Great Kingdom had existed and had represented something different, something better, the world government's legitimacy would evaporate. So they made the truth itself illegal, made seeking knowledge a capital crime, made curiosity punishable by death. This was not confidence. This was fear. Fear that their victory, total as it seemed, could be undone by information, by people learning what had really happened, by the truth emerging from its enforced silence. An empty throne was erected. This became the symbol of the world government, the statement of their principles. The throne sat in the center of Mary Geois, empty, no one sitting on it. This was meant to represent equality among the 20 kingdoms, to show that no single ruler dominated the others, that power was shared, that the world government represented collective rule rather than individual tyranny. This was propaganda, mythology, a story told to make their rule more palatable. Because people can accept collective authority more easily than absolute monarchy, can believe that a council of rulers is more just than a single dictator. The empty throne was meant to reassure, to demonstrate that the world government had limits, that even the celestial dragons acknowledged something above themselves, that absolute power had been refused. But the throne was secretly occupied by Imu, an immortal survivor of the war, someone who had been present during the Void Century, who had fought against the Great Kingdom, who had helped establish the world government, and who had remained ruling in secret for 800 years. Imu's existence transformed the empty throne from symbol to lie, from reassurance to deception. The throne was not empty. Power was not shared. The world government was not collective rule, but absolute tyranny disguised as collective rule. This lie was necessary, was central to how the world government maintained control. Because openly acknowledging absolute power creates resistance. But hiding absolute power behind the facade of shared governance creates acceptance. People believe they understand how the system works, believe it operates according to certain principles, and this belief prevents them from seeing the truth. That one who rules everything, that the empty throne is occupied, that the world government is exactly the kind of tyranny it claims not to be. The gods of the new world were crowned. The celestial dragons elevated themselves above all humanity, declared themselves untouchable, made themselves immune to law, gave themselves the right to do anything to anyone without consequence. This was not gradual, not the slow accumulation of privilege over generations. This was immediate, a deliberate decision by the victors of the Void Century War that they would be gods and everyone else would be servants. This reveals what they really thought about the Great Kingdom's principles, about equality and freedom and shared prosperity. They rejected these completely, chose instead to create the most hierarchical society imaginable, where one group of people stood so far above everyone else that the gap could never be bridged, where divine right was not just claimed but enforced absolutely, where the very idea of equality was made not just wrong but unthinkable. The birth of the world government was not progress, was not the natural evolution of human society towards something better. It was regression disguised as advancement. It was the deliberate creation of a system designed to prevent progress, to freeze the world in a particular configuration, to ensure that the ideas the Great Kingdom represented could never resurface. The world government was born not from hope, but from fear. Not from vision, but from the determination to eliminate all alternative visions. It was born from war and built on lies. And for 800 years, it has maintained itself through the same methods. Through control of information, through suppression of alternatives, through making the truth itself illegal, through creating the mythology of inevitability that makes people believe this is the only way the world can be. The world government was born victorious. But victory does not make something right, does not make it just, does not make it worth preserving. Victory just means you won. And the world government, understanding this, has spent 800 years ensuring that what they won through war they maintain through control, through silence, through making sure no one remembers that things could have been different, that the Great Kingdom offered an alternative, that the void century was not inevitable emptiness but deliberate erasure, that the world they rule is not natural but constructed, built on the ruins of something better, maintained through fear, preserved through lies. The world government was born, and the world has suffered under it ever since. Centuries passed, 800 years of world government rule, 800 years of the void century remaining hidden, 800 years of successful suppression. But truth has a way of persisting, of finding voices, of emerging even when every effort has been made to keep it buried. And one of those voices belonged to a man named Clover. Professor Clover, a scholar from O'Hara, a man who dedicated his life to understanding history, to finding truth, to piecing together fragments that everyone else ignored. He was not a warrior, not a revolutionary, not someone seeking to overthrow the world government. He was just a scholar, someone who believed that knowledge mattered, that understanding the past was important, that truth was worth seeking even when seeking it was dangerous. Scholars of O'Hara uncovered fragments of the truth. Scholars of O'Hara uncovered fragments of the truth. They did not start with the void century, did not deliberately seek forbidden knowledge. They simply studied history, examined ancient texts, compared different sources, asked questions about inconsistencies, and gradually, through decades of careful research, patterns emerged. Gaps appeared, things that did not make sense in the official narrative, references to events that supposedly never happened, mentions of places that should not exist. And these scholars, being scholars, investigated, followed the threads, pursued the questions, not because they wanted to challenge the world government, but because they wanted to understand. Because incomplete knowledge bothered them. Because truth mattered more than safety. Professor Clover decoded the poneglyphs. This was not easy. The ancient language had been lost for centuries. No living person could read it. But Clover was brilliant, patient, dedicated. He studied the symbols, compared them across different poneglyphs, looked for patterns, made educated guesses, refined those guesses through testing, and gradually, over years of effort, he learned to read the ancient language. This was an achievement that cannot be overstated. Clover had recovered knowledge that the world government thought lost forever, had made accessible information that was supposed to remain inaccessible, had given himself the ability to read what the Great Kingdom had written. to understand what they wanted future generations to know. To learn the truth of the Void Century, he discovered the Great Kingdom's existence. This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This was exactly what the world government had been trying to prevent for 800 years. Clover had proof, not speculation, not theory, but documented evidence carved in indestructible stone. The Great Kingdom had existed. It had been real. It had been powerful and advanced. And it had been deliberately erased from history. Clover understood what this meant. Understood that the world government's entire narrative was based on hiding this truth. That their legitimacy depended on people not knowing about the Great Kingdom. That revealing this information would undermine 800 years of careful control. But Clover was a scholar. Truth mattered to him more than politics, more than safety, more than survival. He had found the truth, and he believed the world deserved to know it. Moments before revealing its name, before speaking the one piece of information that would complete his revelation, before finishing the sentence that would expose the world government's greatest lie, Clover was assassinated by the Gorosei. The 5 elders themselves appeared, interrupted his transmission, killed him mid-sentence. This was not standard procedure. This was not how the world government normally handled threats. But Clover was different, was more dangerous than any pirate or revolutionary. Because Clover had the truth, had proof, had the ability to make people understand what had been hidden for 8 centuries. And the Gorosei, understanding this, could not allow him to speak, could not permit the Great Kingdom's name to be revealed, could not risk the truth spreading. So they killed him, directly, immediately, without trial or process. Just execution. Because some knowledge is too dangerous to exist. Some truths threaten power too directly. And Clover had reached that truth, had been moments away from speaking it. And the Gorosei could not allow those moments to pass. O'Hara was erased by Buster Call. Killing Clover was not enough. The Gorosei understood that Clover had not worked alone. That other scholars on O'Hara knew what he knew. That the research could continue even with Clover dead. That the truth, once discovered, was difficult to suppress completely. So they did what they always do when truth threatens control. They eliminated everyone involved. Ordered a Buster Call. 10 battleships. Complete annihilation. Every scholar killed. Every book burned. Every building destroyed. The entire island reduced to a blackened ruin. This was not justice. This was terror. This was the world government demonstrating what happens to those who seek forbidden knowledge. What happens to islands that allow such seeking? What happens when you get too close to the truth? The erasure of O'Hara was meant to be complete. Was meant to eliminate every trace of the research. Every person who knew. Every record of what had been discovered. The world government wanted to reset the situation. To return to a state where the Void Century remained hidden. Where no one knew about the Great Kingdom. Where their control remained unchallenged by information. They almost succeeded. Almost killed everyone. Almost destroyed everything. But erasure is never perfect. One person survived. One child escaped the Buster Call. One witness remained to carry forward what Clover had discovered. Her name was Nico Robin, and she would become something the world government never anticipated. A living library. A walking repository of forbidden knowledge. The voice that would survive when all other voices were silenced. Clover died moments before he could speak the truth. But his death was not the end of the truth. It was just the beginning of its journey to the present. Through Robin, through the stones, through the refusal of knowledge to remain buried, Clover almost spoke. And his almost speaking was enough. Enough to start something that could not be stopped. Enough to create a thread that future generations would pull. Enough to ensure that 800 years of silence would eventually break. Clover was the man who almost spoke. And sometimes, almost is enough. Robin witnessed Clover's death at age 8. Saw the man who had taught her, who had shown her the beauty of knowledge, who had made her feel like her ability to read poneglyphs was valuable rather than cursed, killed mid-sentence. Watched as the Gorose appeared. As Clover tried to speak the name. As his voice was cut off. As his life ended before the truth could be revealed. This was not just trauma. This was education. Robin learned at 8 years old exactly what the world government was willing to do to protect its secrets. Learned that seeking truth was dangerous. That knowledge could kill. That power feared information more than any weapon. And she learned that she, a child who could read poneglyphs, was now the greatest threat the world government faced. Because she was the only one left who could decode the stones. The only one who could recover what Clover had died trying to reveal. She memorized his final words. Everything Clover said before he died. Every revelation he made. Every piece of the puzzle he had assembled. Robin heard it all. Understood it all. Recorded it in her memory with perfect clarity. This was not deliberate. Not conscious decision. Just the natural response of a brilliant child facing overwhelming information in a moment of crisis. She remembered because remembering was all she could do. Because Clover's words were important. Because if she forgot, if the knowledge died with him, then his death meant nothing. His life's work would be erased as completely as Ohara itself. So she remembered, carried his final words with her, became the living continuation of his research, the vessel through which what he discovered would survive into the future. Branded the Devil Child, given a bounty at age 8, made the most wanted person in the world, not for anything she had done, but for what she could do, for her ability to read poneglyphs, for her knowledge of what Clover had discovered, for being the last survivor of Ohara who could continue the Forbidden's research. The world government could not allow her to exist, could not permit someone with her knowledge and abilities to remain free. She had to be captured or killed, had to be eliminated before she could read more poneglyphs, before she could piece together the complete truth, before she could speak what Clover had died trying to say. The bounty was not about justice, was not about punishing crimes, was about ensuring that the Void Century's secrets died with Ohara. That Robin, the last voice capable of speaking those secrets, was silenced. She spent 20 years hunted, 20 years running, 20 years unable to trust anyone because anyone might betray her for the bounty. 20 years moving from place to place, changing identities, hiding her abilities, living in fear that each day might be her last. This was not life. This was survival, constant, exhausting, isolating. Robin could not make friends, could not stay anywhere long enough to feel safe, could not reveal who she really was to anyone. She existed in a state of permanent flight, always moving, always hiding, always one step ahead of those hunting her. This should have broken her, should have made her give up, should have destroyed her ability to care about knowledge or truth or anything beyond basic survival. But it didn't. She endured, persisted, kept moving, kept hiding, kept living. Because she carried something too important to let die. Clover's final words. The knowledge of the void century. The truth that the world government feared. She carried it through 20 years of hell. And she did not break. Reading stones. This was what sustained her. What gave her life meaning beyond mere survival. Whenever she could. Whenever she had the opportunity. Whenever she found a poneglyph. Robin read it. Decoded its message. Added its knowledge to what she already carried. Each stone was a piece of the puzzle. Each message brought her closer to the complete truth. Each poneglyph confirmed that Clover had been right. That the Great Kingdom had existed. That the Void Century had been deliberately erased. That the world government's narrative was false. Robin was not just running. She was continuing the research. Was doing what Clover had died trying to do. Was assembling the fragments. Was working toward the moment when she would know enough. Understand enough. Have enough evidence to speak the truth. To finish what Clover started. To reveal what 800 years of silence had hidden. Carrying silence. But this silence was different from the Void Century's silence. The Void Century was silence imposed. Silence enforced through violence and erasure. Robin's silence was strategic. Chosen. She remained silent not because she accepted the world government's narrative, but because speaking would get her killed. She carried the truth inside her. Protected it. Kept it safe. Waited for the right moment. The right allies. The right conditions. She understood that truth revealed too early to the wrong people in the wrong way would simply be suppressed again. Would get her killed without accomplishing anything. So she waited. Silent. Patient. Carrying 800 years of forbidden knowledge. Waiting for someone she could trust. Someone strong enough to protect her while she spoke. Someone who cared enough about truth to risk everything to hear it. She became a living continuation of Forbidden's history. This is what makes Robin so important. So dangerous to the world government. So essential to understanding the Void Century. She is not just someone who knows the truth. She is the truth. The walking embodiment of everything the world government tried to erase. Every poneglyph she reads adds to her knowledge. Every piece of the puzzle she assembles makes her more complete. She carries Clover's final words. Carries the knowledge of O'Hara's scholars. Carries the ability to decode the Great Kingdom's messages. Carries the truth of the Void Century in a form that cannot be destroyed as easily as books or buildings. Because destroying Robin requires killing her. And killing her is difficult. She is smart, careful, experienced in survival. Protected, eventually, by people who value her for who she is rather than fearing her for what she knows. Robin witnessed Clover's death. But she did not die with him. She survived, escaped, persisted, carried forward what he died protecting. She spent 20 years hunted, but she was not caught, not killed, not silenced. She read the stones, learned the truth, assembled the puzzle. She carried silence, but that silence was pregnant with knowledge. Ready to break, ready to speak, waiting for the moment when speaking would matter. When the truth would have impact rather than just getting her killed. Robin is the child who lived, the survivor of O'Hara, the voice that carries 800 years of suppressed history. The person who will finally speak what Clover died trying to say. She is not ready yet. Not quite. But she is close. Approaching Laugh Tale. Approaching the Rio Poneglyph. approaching the moment when the silence breaks, when the void century is finally revealed, when Clover's death is finally given meaning, when Robin, the child who lived, speaks the truth that has waited 8 centuries to be heard. And when she speaks, everything changes. The silence ends. The void century returns to history. The truth emerges. And the world government, built on lies, begins to crumble. Robin's journey has not been aimless wandering, has not been random flight from island to island. She has been seeking, searching, following the trail that Clover started, reading every poneglyph she could find, assembling the puzzle, moving steadily toward complete understanding. And along the way, she discovered things that made Clover's research concrete, made the void century real. Robin's journey has not been aimless wandering, has not been random flight from island to island. She has been seeking, searching, following the trail that Clover started, reading every poneglyph she could find, assembling the puzzle, moving steadily toward complete understanding. And along the way, she discovered things that made Clover's research concrete, made the void century real, made Joy Boy and the Great Kingdom more than theories. She found proof, evidence, messages that had waited 800 years for someone who could read them. And each discovery brought her closer to the truth, closer to understanding what Clover died trying to reveal, closer to being able to speak the complete story. Robin deciphered Joy Boy's apology on Fishman Island. This was not just another historical text. This was personal, intimate, a message from Joy Boy to the mermaid princess of his time. An apology for a promise broken, for something he had intended to do but could not complete. The promise to raise Fishman Island, to bring it to the surface, to integrate fishmen and merfolk into the surface world, to end the separation that kept them in darkness while others lived in light. Joy Boy had failed. The war had ended before he could fulfill this promise. The Great Kingdom had fallen before the work could be completed. And Joy Boy, in his final act, had left this apology, this acknowledgement of failure, but also this statement of hope, that someone in the future would complete what he could not, that the promise, though broken, was not abandoned, that eventually, someone would come who could do what Joy Boy had tried to do. Reading this apology changed something in Robin, made the void century personal rather than just historical. Joy Boy was not just a figure from the past. He was someone who had made promises, who had cared about people, who had tried to create a better world and failed, who had apologized for that failure and asked the future to succeed where he could not. This was not the behavior of a villain or a conqueror. This was the behavior of someone who cared, who understood that promises matter, that broken promises require acknowledgement, that even in defeat, you owe the people you made promises to an explanation and an apology. Joy Boy became real to Robin in that moment, became someone she could understand, someone whose work she was continuing, someone whose promises she might help fulfill. She read the road, poneglyphs on Zoo. These red stones were different from the historical poneglyphs. They did not contain information about the past. They contained directions, coordinates, information that, when combined from all 4 road poneglyphs, would point to a specific location, to Laugh Tale, to the final island, to the place where the complete truth waited, the Rio poneglyph. The culmination of everything Joy Boy and the Kazuki clan had worked to preserve. Robin reading the road poneglyph on Zoo was significant, was progress, was proof that she was getting closer, that the journey Clover started, that O'Hara's scholars died pursuing, that Robin had continued through 20 years of being hunted, was approaching its destination. The truth was no longer distant, no longer theoretical. It was concrete, specific, located on an island that Robin could reach if she gathered the information from all four road PONEGLY PHS. Each stone brought the past closer to the surface. This is the power of the poneglyphs. Each one, individually, provides only fragments, only pieces of a larger puzzle. But together, they create something complete. Something that reveals not just what happened, but why it happened. Not just that the Great Kingdom existed, but what it stood for. Not just that war occurred, but what that war was really about. Robin has been assembling these pieces for years. For decades. Adding each new poneglyph's knowledge to what she already carried. Creating in her mind a picture of the void century that becomes clearer with each stone she reads. She's not there yet. Does not have the complete picture. But she is close. Closer than anyone has been in 800 years. Close enough that the world government should be terrified. Because once Robin reaches Laughtail, once she reads the Rio Poneglyph, she will know everything. Will have the complete truth. Will be able to speak what Clover died trying to say. And the world government, built on the suppression of that truth, will have no defense. Laughtail awaited. Still awaits. The final island. The place where Galder Roger went and learned the truth and laughed. The place where the One Piece sits. The place where the Rio Poneglyph preserves the complete history of the Void Century in a single, comprehensive text. Laughtail is not just a destination. It is a promise. A guarantee that the truth exists. That it can be found. That someone who is determined enough, strong enough, brave enough can learn what really happened 800 years ago. Roger reached it. Learned the truth. But Roger was too early. The world was not ready. The conditions were not right. Roger could laugh at what he learned, but could not do anything with that knowledge. So he left it there. Left it waiting. Left it for someone else. For someone who would come later. For someone who could actually use the truth to change the world rather than just knowing it. Robin is that someone. Or part of that someone. She has the knowledge to read the Rio Poneglyph, has the determination to reach Laughtail, has the courage to speak what she learns there. But she also has something Clover did not have, something O'Hara's scholars lacked. She has allies, has people who protect her not because of what she knows but because of who she is, has a crew that values her. A captain who declared war on the world government to save her. People who would die to ensure she can continue her work. This is what makes Robin different from previous scholars who sought the truth. She is not alone. Not isolated. Not just a researcher working in a library. She is part of something larger. Part of a crew that is moving toward Laughtail for their own reasons. But who will support her when she reads what is there? Who will help her speak what she learns? Who will protect her while she reveals the truth that the world government has hidden for 800 years? The promise Joy Boy made has been remembered. By the fishmen and merfolk who passed the story down through generations. By the Sea Kings who still wait to fulfill their role. By Robin who read the apology and understood what it meant. The promise was broken. Joy Boy failed. But promises do not die just because the person who made them dies. Promises persist. Wait for someone else to fulfill them. Wait for conditions to change. Wait for the moment when what was impossible becomes possible. Joy Boy could not raise Fishman Island. Could not complete what he had started. But someone will. Eventually, when the time is right, when all the pieces are in place, when Robin has read the complete truth, when Luffy has reached Laugh Tale, when the world government's lies are exposed, when the world understands what was hidden, the promise will be fulfilled. Not by Joy Boy, but by someone who carries the same will, who shares the same dream, who understands that some promises are worth keeping even 800 years after they were made. The promise is remembered, and what is remembered can be fulfilled. The stones brought the past closer, and the past, once brought close enough, becomes the present, becomes relevant, becomes actionable, becomes the foundation for changing the future. Robin reads. Robin remembers. Robin approaches Laugh Tale, and the promise, 800 years old, approaches fulfillment. The silence is breaking. The truth is emerging. And the world, finally, is ready to listen. 800 years after the Void Century. 800 years of the truth being hidden. 800 years of only scattered fragments and decoded poneglyphs providing glimpses of what really happened. And then science caught up with legend. A man named Dr. Vegapunk, the world's greatest scientist, working for the world government but pursuing truth beyond what they wanted him to know, confirmed what the scholars had theorized, confirmed what Robin had been assembling, confirmed that the Void Century was real, that the Great Kingdom had existed, that the world's current geography was not natural but created through war. Vegapunk provided something that had been missing. Scientific proof. Measurable evidence. Facts that could not be dismissed as interpretation or bias. The past was no longer just history. It was science. And science cannot be suppressed as easily as stories. Vegapunk confirmed that the ancient kingdom's technology surpassed modern civilization. This was not speculation based on ancient texts. This was analysis of actual devices. Machines that still functioned after 900 years. Energy systems that modern science barely understood. Engineering achievements that contemporary technology could not replicate. Vegapunk, with his immense knowledge and resources, studied these ancient remnants, tested them, analyzed them, tried to understand how they worked. And he concluded something astonishing. The ancient kingdom had been more advanced than the present, had achieved a level of technological sophistication that had been lost during the Void Century. That the war had not just killed people and destroyed buildings, but had actually set human progress backward by centuries. That the world after the Void Century was less advanced than the world before it. This was devastating to the world government's narrative, because it meant the Great Kingdom was not primitive, was not a threat because of barbarism or chaos, was actually superior, more advanced, more capable, and the world government, in destroying it, had destroyed something better. Vegapunk confirmed that the sea level rise was caused by ancient weapons. This was perhaps his most dangerous discovery, because the world government had always explained the current geography as natural, had claimed that the scattered islands and vast oceans were just how the world was, had never acknowledged that things might have been different. But Vegapunk proved otherwise, proved that sea levels had risen dramatically and unnaturally, proved that this rise coincided with the Void Century, proved that the ancient weapons used in war had reshaped the world's geography. This was not theory. This was measurable geological evidence. The ocean floor showed signs of rapid change. The coastlines indicated sudden flooding. The entire planet bore the scars of massive, unnatural geographic transformation. And it had all happened during the Void Century, during the war between the Great Kingdom and the 20 Kingdoms. This meant the current world, the world government ruled, was not natural, was not inevitable, was created through violence, through weapons used in ways they were never meant to be used, through war that reshaped reality itself. He confirmed that Joy Boy was a real figure from 900 years ago. Not a myth, not a legend, not a story told to children. Joy Boy had actually existed, had been a real person who lived during the Void Century, who fought in the war, who made promises that survived him. Vegapunk found evidence of Joy Boy in multiple sources. In ancient records, in technological signatures, in energy patterns that matched what the Nika fruit would produce. Joy Boy was real. The Great Kingdom was real. The war was real. The reshaping of the world was real. Everything the world government had tried to dismiss as legend or myth or misinterpretation was actually factual history. Vegapunk proved it. Not through finding poneglyphs or decoding ancient languages, but through science, through measuring reality and showing that reality confirmed what the Forbidden's history claimed. His egghead broadcast shattered the world government's geological lies. Vegapunk understood what his discoveries meant, understood that the world government could not allow this information to spread, understood that he was in danger. So he prepared, created a broadcast, recorded a message that would be transmitted to the entire world. A message revealing his discoveries, explaining that the sea level rise was not natural, that the ancient kingdom had existed, that the world's geography had been shaped by war, that everything people had been taught about their world was false. This broadcast was Vegapunk's final act, his way of ensuring the truth survived even if he did not. And it worked. The message began transmitting. People across the world heard it, learned that their reality was not what they thought, that the world government had been lying, that history had been deliberately falsified. The geological lies were shattered. People began questioning, began wondering, began doubting the narrative they had always accepted. Vegapunk's broadcast did not reveal everything, did not explain the complete truth of the Void Century, but it did something more important. It proved that questioning was justified, that seeking truth was necessary, that the world government could not be trusted. It created doubt. And doubt is the beginning of understanding. Vegapunk was science, was evidence, was proof that could not be dismissed as interpretation or bias. The scholars of O'Hara could be called misguided, could be accused of twisting history to serve their purposes. But Vegapunk? Vegapunk was the world government's own scientist, was someone they trusted, was someone whose work they relied on. And he turned against them. Not out of political opposition, but out of commitment to truth. Because science does not care about politics, does not bend to power. Science is what is measurable, what is provable, what is real. And reality, when properly measured, confirmed that the world government had been lying for 800 years. That the Void Century was not empty but erased. That the Great Kingdom had been real and advanced. That the current world was shaped by war. That everything the world government claimed was false. Vegapunk proved this, and his proof could not be suppressed, could not be explained away, could only be silenced by silencing him, which is exactly what the world government tried to do. Science confirmed the past, made legend into fact, made Forbidden's history into measurable reality. made 800 years of suppression seem increasingly futile. Because you can kill scholars, can burn libraries, can make research illegal, but you cannot kill science, cannot destroy evidence, cannot make reality conform to your narrative when reality contradicts it. The past is written in geology, in atmospheric conditions, in the technological remnants that still function, in measurable, provable facts that anyone with the knowledge and tools can verify. Vegapunk verified them, confirmed that the Void Century was real, that the Great Kingdom was real, that Joy Boy was real, that everything the world government wanted hidden was actually just hidden history waiting to be recovered through science. The past was no longer just stories carved in stone. It was scientific fact, measurable truth, reality that could not be suppressed no matter how hard the world government tried. Vegapunk confirmed what Clover theorized, what Robin assembled, what the Poneglyphs preserved. He made the Void Century undeniable, made the truth unavoidable, made the silence impossible to maintain. Science speaks. And when science speaks, lies crumble. But the world government did not accept this revelation passively, did not allow Vegapunk to simply broadcast his discoveries without response. They fought back, used every tool available, employed betrayal, employed violence, employed the same methods they had used for 800 years to suppress truth. Because allowing Vegapunk's broadcast to complete would mean the end of their control, would mean people understanding that they had been lied to, would mean the beginning of questions that could not be answered without admitting the lies. So they fought, desperately, using everything they had, not to disprove Vegapunk's claims, because they could not be disproven, but to silence him before he could finish speaking. Vegapunk was betrayed by his own satellite, by one of the artificial intelligences he had created to assist his research. This satellite had been compromised, had been turned by the world government, had been convinced or programmed or coerced into serving their interests rather than pursuing truth. This betrayal reveals something important about how the world government operates. They do not just use force. They infiltrate. They corrupt. They turn people's own creations against them. They had access to Vegapunk's facility, had access to his satellites, had the means to compromise his work from the inside, and they used this access to stop his broadcast, to prevent the complete truth from emerging, to ensure that while Vegapunk might reveal some things, he would not reveal everything. The betrayal was not just personal. It was strategic. It was the world government using every advantage to maintain control. His message was cut short. The broadcast began, reached the world, started explaining the truth, but it did not finish. Before Vegapunk could reveal everything, before he could explain the complete history, before he could name the Great Kingdom or detail exactly what happened during the Void Century, the transmission was interrupted, cut off mid-sentence, silenced in the same way Clover had been silenced. This was not coincidence. This was pattern. The world government always stops truth at the same point, right before the complete revelation, right before the final detail that would make everything clear. They allow fragments, allow hints, allow people to learn that something was hidden, but they never allow the complete truth to emerge, never allow the name to be spoken, never allow the final piece of the puzzle to be placed. Because fragments can be dismissed, hints can be ignored, but complete truth cannot be denied. But it was too late. This is the crucial point. This is where the world government strategy failed. Because even though Vegapunk's broadcast was incomplete, even though it was cut off before he could finish, it had already done enough. It had already planted doubt, had already made people question, had already revealed that the world government had been lying about fundamental things. The geographical lies were exposed. The sea level rise was explained. The ancient kingdom was mentioned. Joy Boy was confirmed. These revelations, partial as they were, could not be taken back, could not be erased. The world government could silence Vegapunk, but they could not silence the questions his broadcast created, could not make people forget what they had heard, could not restore the previous state where their narrative was unchallenged. The world had heard enough to begin questioning. This is what made Vegapunk's broadcast successful despite being incomplete. Because truth does not need to be complete to be effective. It just needs to be enough. Enough to create doubt. Enough to make people wonder. Enough to start them asking questions. And once people start questioning, they do not stop. They want answers. They seek information. They compare what they are told with what they observe. They notice inconsistencies. They demand explanations. Vegapunk's broadcast started this process, gave people a reason to question what they had always accepted, gave them specific claims to investigate, gave them the knowledge that they had been lied to about something fundamental. And this knowledge, once possessed, cannot be surrendered. People who know they have been lied to do not trust easily again. They become skeptical, critical, unwilling to accept official narratives without evidence. Vegapunk created an entire world of skeptics, created millions of people who now doubted the world government, who now wondered what else they had been lied to about, who now sought truth for themselves rather than accepting what they were told. Silence fought back. The world government used every tool to stop Vegapunk. They succeeded in killing him, succeeded in stopping his broadcast, succeeded in preventing a complete truth from emerging. But they failed in their larger purpose, failed to maintain the silence, failed to keep people from questioning, failed to preserve the state where their lies were unchallenged. Because silence, once broken, is difficult to restore. Once people have heard that there is something to question, they question. Once they know that truth has been hidden, they seek it. Once they understand that they have been lied to, they stop believing the lies. The world government fought back, but their fighting only confirmed that there was something worth fighting about. Only proved that the truth was important enough to kill for. Only demonstrated that Vegapunk was right. That the silence had been hiding something. That 800 years of suppression had been protecting lies. Silence fought back, but silence lost. The battle perhaps, but not the war. Because the world, having heard enough, would not return to ignorance, would not accept silence again, would continue questioning until the complete truth emerged, until every lie was exposed, until the void century was no longer void but filled with recovered history. Silence fought, but truth persisted. And persistence, in the end, defeats even the most determined suppression. And now we arrive at the present, at the moment where 800 years of silence is finally breaking, where the void century is being recovered piece by piece, where voices that were supposed to be eliminated forever are speaking, where truth that was supposed to remain hidden is emerging into light. Robin approaches Laughtail. Vegapunk has shattered the geological lies. The world questions. And the future that has been waiting for 800 years, is finally arriving. Not all at once, not through single revelation, but gradually, inevitably, the accumulation of fragments into something complete, the assembly of pieces into a picture that cannot be ignored, the breaking of silence into sound that cannot be silenced again. Robin now approaches Laugh-Tale. She has the knowledge to read the Rio Poneglyph, has the determination to reach the final island, has the protection of all eyes strong enough to get her there. She is close, closer than anyone except Roger has ever been. And unlike Roger, Robin is not too early. The world is ready, has been prepared by Vegapunk's broadcast, has been made skeptical by the world government's obvious lies, is asking questions that Robin's knowledge can answer. When Robin reaches Laugh-Tale, when she reads the Rio Poneglyph, when she learns the complete truth of the Void Century, she will not just laugh as Roger did. She will speak, will reveal, will tell the world what she learned, will finish what Clover started and Vegapunk continued, will break the silence completely. The Rio Poneglyph remains unread, waiting on Laugh-Tale, preserving the complete history of the Void Century. Everything Joy Boy and the Kozuki clan wanted future generations to know. The Great Kingdom's true name, its values and achievements, the reason for the war, the use of the ancient weapons, the betrayal and defeat, the promises made and broken, all of it carved in a single comprehensive text. This poneglyph is not just history, it is vindication. Proof that everything the world government tried to hide was real. That the scholars who died seeking this truth were right. That 800 years of suppression was protecting lies. The Rio Poneglyph waits. But not for much longer. Robin is coming. And when she reads it, when she speaks what it says, everything changes. The Void Century returns to history. The Great Kingdom is remembered. Joy Boy's story is told. The truth, complete and undeniable, emerges. Theories whisper about what this means, about what happens when the truth is finally revealed. Some say Aimu will be exposed, that the empty throne's occupation will become known, that the world will learn that one person has been ruling secretly for 800 years. That the lie about shared power will be revealed, that people will understand how completely they have been deceived. This exposure would destroy the world government's legitimacy, would make their rule intolerable, would create conditions where rebellion becomes not just possible but inevitable. Because people will not accept absolute tyranny once they understand that it has been disguised as something else. Once they know that the empty throne is occupied, once they learn that everything they were told about how the world is governed was false. Some theories say the Great Kingdom's name will finally be spoken, that the one piece of information the world government has most desperately protected will be revealed. And this name, for reasons we can only guess, is important, is powerful, is something that once known, changes how people think. Perhaps the name reveals something about the kingdom's nature. Perhaps it connects to something in the present. Perhaps it is a word that cannot be spoken without making people question everything. We do not know why the name matters so much. Why Clover was killed before he could say it. Why the world government protects this information above almost everything else. But we know it matters. And we know that when the name is finally spoken, when people learn what the Great Kingdom was called, something will change. Some understanding will emerge that makes the world government's lies impossible to maintain. Other theories suggest that the D clan will awaken together. That learning the truth will activate something in those who carry the D will unite them. Will make them understand what they are and what they represent. The bearers of D are scattered across the world. Some know their significance. Most do not. They carry the letter without understanding what it means. But the truth might change this, might make them understand that they are descendants of the great kingdom, that they carry the will of those who oppose divine rule, that they are, as the world government claims, natural enemies of God, and this understanding might unite them, might create coordination where before there was only scattered individual action, might transform the bearers of D from separate people who happen to share a letter into a movement, into an organized force working toward the completion of what the great kingdom started. This would terrify the world government, because individual bearers of D are dangerous. But all of them united, all of them understanding what they represent, all of them working together, that would be unstoppable. The century that was erased may finally speak. This is what all the theories point toward, what all the evidence suggests, what 800 years of suppression has been delaying. The void century will be recovered, will be returned to history, will become known not just to scholars or pirates who reach Laugh-Tale, but to everyone, to the entire world. People will learn what happened, will understand what was hidden from them, will know that the great kingdom existed, that it represented something better, that it was destroyed not because it was evil, but because it challenged divine rule, that the current world order was created through violence and maintained through lies. And this knowledge will change everything, will make people question not just history, but their present, will make them wonder whether the world could be different, could be organized according to the great kingdom's principles rather than the world government's hierarchy, will make them imagine alternatives. And imagination is the beginning of transformation. The future that waits is not determined, is not inevitable. The truth emerging does not automatically mean the world government falls, does not guarantee that people will act on what they learn, does not ensure that knowing the past will change the future. But it creates possibility, creates conditions where change becomes imaginable, where alternatives can be conceived, where people have the information necessary to make real choices about what kind of world they want. The future waits. For Robin to reach Laugh-Tale, for the Rio Poneglyph to be read, for the complete truth to be spoken, for the world to hear and understand, for people to decide what to do with knowledge that has been hidden for 8 centuries. The future waits, but it will not wait forever. The moment approaches. The silence breaks. The truth emerges. And the world, finally is ready to listen. And so we return to where we began, to silence, to the void century, to the 100 years that were removed from time. But now we understand that silence was never complete, that even the most thorough erasure leaves traces, that voices survive no matter how hard power tries to eliminate them. The void century was supposed to be empty, was supposed to be void, was supposed to be nothing, but it was never nothing. It was filled with voices, with people who refused to be silenced, with truth that refused to die, with stories that persisted through 800 years of suppression. The stones remained, the scholars searched, the child survived, the scientist confirmed, the revolutionary waited. These are the voices that survived the silence. And their surviving means the silence has ended. Clover spoke and died. His voice was cut off mid-sentence. His final words were never completed. The great kingdom's name was never spoken. But what he said before he died mattered. Started something. Gave Robin the beginning of understanding. gave the world proof that there was something to question. Clover's death was not the end of his voice. It was the transformation of his voice from individual to collective. From one man speaking to many people carrying forward what he started, Clover spoke. And though he died, his speaking continues. Through Robin, through everyone who learned from O'Hara, through everyone who understood that Forbidden's knowledge is worth dying for. Clover's voice survived, not in his body, but in the echoes of what he said, in the questions he raised, in the research he began. His voice is one of the voices that survived the silence, and it speaks still. Robin listened and lived. She heard Clover's final words, memorized them, carried them through 20 years of being hunted, read the poneglyphs, assembled the fragments, continued the research, approached the truth. Robin is not just a survivor. She is a continuation. She is Clover's voice made mobile, made persistent, made impossible to silence as easily as Clover was silenced. Because Robin is careful, is experienced, is protected. She survives where Clover died. And her survival means the knowledge survives. The truth survives. The Void Century's secrets survive. Robin listened to Clover, but she also listened to the stones, to Joy Boy's apology, to the ancient kingdom's messages, to 800 years of voices calling from the past. She listened, and by listening, she gave those voices a way to speak in the present. Robin is the voice that carries all voices, the living library that preserves what was supposed to be forgotten. Her listening means the silence is broken. Her living means the truth persists. Her voice, when she finally speaks, will speak for everyone who tried to speak before her and was silenced. Vegapunk proved and was silenced. Science confirmed the past, made legend into measurable fact, made the world government's lies obvious. Vegapunk did not read poneglyphs, did not study Forbidden's history in the traditional sense, but he reached the same conclusions through different means, through measuring reality, through understanding that the world's geography was not natural, through recognizing that the ancient kingdom's technology was superior to the present, through confirming that Joy Boy was real. Vegapunk's voice was scientific, was authoritative in ways that historical research is not, was undeniable because it was based on measurement rather than interpretation. And though he was silenced before he could finish speaking, what he said mattered. Created doubt, created questions, created the conditions where other voices could be heard. Vegapunk proved the past, and his proof survives even though he does not. Dragon waits. The son of a marine hero who became the world's most wanted revolutionary. Dragon knows something. Knows more than he says. Knows about the Void Century. About the Great Kingdom. About why resistance matters. Dragon's silence is not suppression. Is not ignorance. Is strategy. He waits for the right moment. The moment when speaking will have impact. When revelation will create change rather than just getting him killed. Dragon understands that truth alone is not enough. That people need to be ready to hear it. That conditions must be right for knowledge to transform into action. So he waits, builds his revolutionary army, prepares for the moment when the truth emerges fully. When Robin speaks, when the Void Century is revealed, when the world understands what has been hidden, then Dragon will act. Will use that understanding. Will transform knowledge into revolution. Dragon's voice has not spoken yet, but it waits. ready, patient, knowing that the moment approaches when silence becomes speaking, when waiting becomes action, when preparation becomes transformation. The stones remain, the poneglyphs, indestructible, eternal, scattered across the world, preserving truth that cannot be eliminated. These stones are voices in the most literal sense. They speak, not with sound, but with meaning, with information carved so deeply that nothing can erase it. The stones remain because they were designed to remain, were created specifically to survive when everything else was destroyed. Joy Boy understood that physical records could be burned, that people could be killed, that civilizations could be erased. But stone? Stone properly prepared? Stone made indestructible through the Kazuki clan's art? That stone would last, would preserve, would wait 800 years if necessary for someone who could read it. The stones remained, and by remaining, they proved that silence is temporary, that truth persists, that what is carved deeply enough cannot be erased no matter how hard power tries. The sea continues to rise. Vegapunk confirmed this. The process that began during the Void Century has not stopped. The world is still being reshaped. The oceans still climb higher. The consequences of ancient war still unfold. This rising sea is itself a voice, a reminder, a physical manifestation of the past's persistence. Every year the water rises a little higher. Every decade coastlines change a little more. The sea speaks what history tried to hide, says that the Void Century was real, that the ancient weapons were used, that the world was reshaped, that the consequences continue. The sea cannot be silenced, cannot be convinced to stop rising, cannot be forced to conform to the world government's narrative. The sea is truth made physical, made undeniable, made impossible to ignore. The sea rises, and its rising says that the past is not past, that the Void Century continues, that what began 800 years ago has not ended, that the world is still shaped by what happened then. The sea speaks, and its speaking cannot be stopped. History breathes quietly, waiting to be remembered. This is the state we are in now. The state where 800 years of silence is breaking, where voices that were supposed to be eliminated are speaking, where truth that was supposed to remain hidden is emerging, where the Void Century is being recovered. Not all at once, not through single revelation, but gradually, through accumulated voices, through Clover's research and Robin's reading and Vegapunk's science and Dragon's preparation and the stone's persistence and the sea's rising. All of these together. All of these voices speaking in different ways. All of these saying the same thing. That the silence was a lie. That the Void Century was real. That the Great Kingdom existed. That the world government's narrative is false. That truth cannot be permanently suppressed. That voices survive no matter how thoroughly power tries to eliminate them. History breathes. This is not metaphor. This is description of what is happening now. The past is not dead, not gone, not safely buried under 8 centuries of suppression. The past lives, breathes, stirs, prepares to wake fully, to speak completely, to reveal everything. History breathes quietly now, but it will not remain quiet. The breathing will become speaking. The whisper will become declaration. The fragments will become complete truth. And when that happens, when history stops breathing quietly and starts speaking loudly, the world changes. the world government's control evaporates. The lies are exposed. The alternatives become visible. The future becomes open. History breathes quietly, waiting to be remembered. But the waiting is almost over. The remembering has begun. And once begun, remembering cannot be stopped. The voices that survive the silence will speak, fully, completely, undeniably. And the void century, erased for 800 years, will return to history, will become known, will transform from nothing into everything, from void into voice, from silence into speaking. The voices survived, and their survival means the silence ends. The void century speaks, and the world, finally ready, listens. And so our journey through the void century comes to its end. Though the story itself continues, though the truth still waits to be fully revealed, though the voices that survive still have more to say. We have traveled from 900 years ago to the present day. From the great kingdom's flourishing to its fall. From Joy Boy's promises to their pending fulfillment. From the creation of the void to its breaking. From silence to the beginning of speaking. We have seen how erasure, however thorough, is never complete. How voices, however suppressed, survive. How truth, however hidden, persists.